The year is 1994. A man in his mid-50s, a watchmaker named Walter Lang, stands in the ruins of a factory in Glashütte, Germany, a town so small most maps skip it. He holds a single rusty machine part, a lathe spindle recovered from the rubble of a building the Soviet army dismantled 46 years earlier. This factory once produced some of the most complex pocket watches ever made. In 1900, a single Lange and Sonne pocket chronometer took 2 years to assemble. It contained 723 hand-finished components. It was more accurate than any wristwatch on the market a century later. And by 1948, the Soviet government had bulldozed the workshops, seized the tooling, and declared the brand dead. You have probably heard the story of the holy trinity of watchmaking: Patek Philippe, Vacheron Constantin, Audemars Piguet. These are the names that command $300,000 at auction. The names whispered in Geneva. Auction rooms when a rare perpetual calendar appears under the hammer. But there is a fourth name, one that predates all three in its industrial origin, one that built watches so complex they could not be mass-produced, a name that was erased for over 40 years and then returned to outbuild the giants using nothing but the invisible craft hidden inside its calibers. That name is Lang & Sonne, and the watch on your wrist, whatever it is, owes more to this forgotten atelier than to any Swiss maison. The visible world tells you that Swiss watchmaking invented luxury. The price tags, the boutiques on Rue du Rhône, the film stars wearing Nautiluses at Cannes. That story is complete, polished, and sold in every magazine. But the invisible world holds a different ledger. In that ledger, the founding date of precision watchmaking in Germany is not 1839, the year Adolphe Lange registered his first trademark. It is 13 years earlier, 1826, when a 17-year-old Saxon apprentice named Ferdinand Adolphe Lange traveled to Paris to study under the greatest watchmaker the world had ever seen. That master was Abraham Louis Breguet, the same Breguet who invented the tourbillon in 1795, the same Breguet who built the Marie Antoinette, a watch so complex it took 44 years to complete and required 823 components. Ferdinand Adolphe Lange studied in Breguet's atelier for 4 years. He learned the language of invisible craft, anglage, the polishing of movement edges until they shine like mirrors. Côte de Genève, the decorative striping that serves as a dust trap. Guilloché, the engine turn patterns that catch light at specific angles. He did not just learn these techniques, he systematized them. When he returned to Glashütte in 1845, at the age of 30, he did not open a single workshop. He opened an entire industry. He built a factory that employed 231 watchmakers by 1870. He created a state-sponsored school that trained the next generation of German precision engineers. And he designed movements that, in pure component count and finishing precision, exceeded anything being made in Geneva at the same time. Here is the first crack in the official story. In 1851, the Great Exhibition in London awarded a gold medal to Lange and Sonne, for a pocket watch that contained a perpetual calendar, a moon phase display that lost 1 day in 1,250 years, and a balanced spring made from an alloy so pure it had to be drawn by hand through diamond dies. The watch did not just keep time, it held the heavens. And the medal was not a participation trophy. It was the highest honor of the exhibition, the same prize awarded to the steam engine and the McCormick Reaper. Now, step into the atelier. The air smells of heated brass, old leather, and the faint metallic tang of freshly cut steel. You hear the squeak of a lathe belt, the rapid click-click-click of a depthing tool adjusting gear meshes, and the sharp snap of a movement spring seating into position. The watchmaker's hands move with a precision that seems inhuman. His thumb rotates the crown exactly 330 degrees. His forefinger places a screw the size of a grain of sand onto a plate without a tweezers. His breath slows as he adjusts the balance spring's terminal curve. This is not assembly. This is surgery on a scale that consumes time. Consider this. In 1900, a Patek Philippe minute repeater required approximately 2,800 hours of labor. A Vacheron Constantin perpetual calendar chronograph required approximately 3,200 hours. An A. Lange on son Grande Complication pocket watch, the Tourbillon pour le Mérite, required exactly 4,500 hours. That is the equivalent of a single craftsman working 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, for over 2 years on one watch. And that was before any dial assembly, any case engraving, any final regulation. The official story says Swiss watches defined the pinnacle. The invisible ledger says Lange defined the ceiling. If you have ever caught yourself staring at a watch dial under a loupe instead of checking the time, you know the difference between owning a watch and reading one. You have felt that moment when the crystal reflects your own eye back at you, and you realize the object on your wrist is not a tool. It is a tiny machine built by a human hand, for hands, to be passed to hands you will never meet. That number, 4,500 hours for a single watch, is the kind of fact that changes how you see everything on your wrist. If you want to keep uncovering the invisible stories behind the dials, subscribe so you never miss the next layer of this hidden world. And tell me in the comments, what is the most time you would invest in a single object, and what would it be? That is the relationship Lange wanted. The dial was never the point. The dial was a door. Behind it, the balance wheel beats once every beat, oscillating at exactly 18,000 beats per hour. That rhythm was chosen not for accuracy, but for durability. At 18,000 beats per hour, the amplitude, the arc of the balance wheel swing remained stable for years without adjustment. The Swiss had already moved to higher frequencies for theoretical precision. Lange stayed at 18,000 because a stable amplitude means a stable watch, means a watch that outlives its owner. The second crack. In 1921, Lange produced a chronometer movement so precise it qualified for the Observatory of Geneva certification, a Swiss body testing a German caliber on its own home ground. The movement, caliber 41.9, contained 127 components in a diameter of 33 millimeters. It was thinner than a 1-franc coin, and it won the highest chronometric score in its class for 3 consecutive years. Not Patek, not Vacheron, Lange. Then, in 1945, the Soviet army dismantled the factory. The tooling was shipped east. The master craftsmen were scattered. The archives were burned. On the surface, the brand ceased to exist. But the invisible story does not stop when the visible story ends. In 1990, a young man named Gunther Blümlein, an engineer who had never worked in watchmaking, discovered a crate of original Lange tooling in a disused barn near Dresden. The tools had been hidden by a watchmaker named Rudolf Schmid, who had buried them under a floorboard the night before the Soviets arrived. Schmid had never told anyone. When Blümlein opened the crate, he found 347 original tempering dies, 9 hand-drawn from 52-step finishing schedules, and a personal journal belonging to Ferdinand Adolphe Lange himself, written in a neat, precise hand in ink that had faded to the color of dried blood. That journal contained the single most important insight into Lange's philosophy. In an entry dated May 2nd, 1867, Lange wrote, "The buyer pays for what he sees on the dial. He stays for what he cannot see in the movement. If the hidden surfaces are as perfect as the visible, the watch becomes an heirloom. If they are cut with shortcuts, it becomes a product. I am not selling products. The journal also contained the design for what would become the Lange 1, the watch that relaunched the brand in 1994. The Lange 1's dial is famous, asymmetric, with a large date window inspired by the Dresden Semper Opera House's 5-minute clock. But the invisible story is in the movement. The Lange 1's caliber L901.0 contains 407 components. It is hand-decorated with Glashütte ribbing, not Côte de Genève. A wider, more pronounced striping that requires a larger cutting head and more skill. The balance cock is engraved by hand. The gold chattons, the settings for the jewels, are thermally blued, then polished to a black mirror finish under a microscope. You expect a diamond. What you find is a steel balance wheel, a beryllium copper hairspring, and a mainspring that stores exactly 72 hours of power reserve. Luminescent hands would have been simpler, lighter materials would have been cheaper, but Lange chose steel, brass, and gold because those materials age. They patina. They become yours. The third crack. In 2008, the brand that did not exist for 40 years became the first watchmaker in the world to produce a movement with a constant force escapement in a wristwatch, the Lange 31. The caliber LOS 3.1 uses a mainspring that is over 2 meters long, coiled into a barrel smaller than a thumbnail. It delivers 31 days of power reserve. That is 31 days of uninterrupted balance wheel oscillation, constant amplitude, no variance in accuracy. The patent describes the energy management system as using a hydraulic clutch driven by a helical spring. No other manufacturer had attempted it. No other manufacturer has replicated it. Lange simply did it, announced it, and moved on to the next problem. Now, the fourth crack brings us back to Walter Lange, that man standing in the rubble in 1994. He was not a young watchmaker. He was a man in his 70s who had spent 40 years writing insurance policies because his family's factory had been erased. He had no funding from a conglomerate. He had no Swiss patron. He raised the capital from 450 individual investors, many of them former workers' descendants who still lived in Glashütte. They invested because they remembered the heirlooms their grandparents had passed down. They invested because they had held a watch that felt heavier than it should, that caught light differently than a new watch, that still beat at exactly 18,000 beats per hour 70 years after it was built. The moment Walter Lange held the first new Lange 1 movement in his hands, assembled not in a factory, but in a converted schoolhouse with windows he had to tape against the cold, he said a single sentence recorded by the photographer who was present. He said, "It beats the same way my father's watch beat." That is not marketing copy. That is a living connection to a dead craftsman transmitted through a tiny spinning wheel of brass and steel. The visible story of luxury watchmaking says that provenance is a matter of certificates and auction records. The invisible story says provenance is a matter of handing a grandson a watch he must wind by hand every day, a routine that forces him to pause and touch what his grandfather touched. Consider this. In 2013, at Christie's Geneva, a platinum Patek Philippe reference, 517 split seconds chronograph sold for $4.3 million. It had 24 complications. It required 35,000 hours of development. It was beautiful, masterful, and undeniable. But that same year, a one-of-a-kind Lange&Söhne Datograph Perpetual Tourbillon sold at auction for a fraction of that price, and the buyer was not a collector with a vault in Switzerland. The buyer was a retired physician from Munich. He had owned one Lange for 30 years. He bought the second one not as an investment, but as a companion. He said in the catalog interview, "I do not want a watch that impresses other people. I want a watch that reminds me of the day I finished medical school, the day my daughter was born, and the day I will leave behind." The retired physician from Munich did not buy a chronograph. He bought a time capsule for his memory. If you want more stories that separate the custodian from the collector, subscribe. Because these are the watches that outlive their owners by design. And in the comments, tell me, what is one watch you own that holds a memory you would pay any price to keep? That is the invisible world of luxury. The watch is a custodian relationship. You do not own it. You borrow it for your lifetime and hand it to the next custodian. And the value is not in the price tag. The value is in the fact that it cannot be serviced overnight, that it cannot be repaired by sending it to a general service center, that the craftsman who built it has to be alive or his notebooks have to survive. The collector who sees only the dial buys the wrong watch for the rest of his life. The collector who reads the movement buys one watch that lasts 2 centuries. And the movement in a lung does not just last 2 centuries. It beats at the same tempo your great-grandfather heard from his pocket watch. The same tempo, the same method of timekeeping, the same ritual of winding by hand, feeling the mainspring tension rise with each rotation, hearing the single click when the ratchet wheel locks and the power is stored. Walter Lang did not just rebuild a brand. He resurrected a philosophy. He refused to use quartz movements in any watch, ever. He refused to position Lang as a rival to the Swiss. He simply made the most finished movements in Germany, in a town of 900 people, using tools that had been buried in a barn for 46 years. And in the process, he built the first luxury watch to be accepted by the industry as a true contemporary of the Holy Trinity. Not a competitor, but a parallel tradition. How did he do it? With exactly the same methods Ferdinand Adolphe Lang used in Etoile in 1867. He trained apprentices in a schoolhouse. He paid them for 4 years of full-time study. He did not patent finished designs. He patented processes. The specific burnishing method for the balance pivots, the unique 2-part alloy for the click spring, the thermal blue formula for the screws that produces a color that deepens, not fades, over 20 years. Those patents are the invisible ledger. They are the evidence that no other watchmaker can simply copy a Lange finishing standard. They could try, but they would need to use Lange's specific burnishing paste, which is still mixed by hand according to a formula kept in a safe in Glashütte. They would need to train their apprentices for 4 years using Lange's original curriculum. They would need to build a mainspring barrel that takes 1 hour to assemble by hand. A barrel that in a standard Swiss manufacture takes 20 minutes with a purpose-built machine. The world that sees price tags thinks a $250,000 Lange 1 Tourbillon is expensive. The invisible world knows it is cheap. Because you cannot put a price on a piece of Ferdinand Adolphe Lang's 1943 journal, written in ink that has faded to the color of dried blood, describing the exact method of polishing a balanced spring that his great-grandson would use 150 young years later. When Walter Lang held that first movement in the converted schoolhouse, he was not merely testing a prototype. He was testing a philosophy against 46 years of absence. The question was not whether the movement ran. The question was whether it ran the same way. Whether the care embedded in each component could survive a half-century gap in institutional memory. That is a test no Swiss manufacturer has ever faced. No Patek movement waited 46 years between the death of one watchmaker and the hands of his grandson. No Vacheron Calibre required its builder to reconstruct a tempering furnace from a single paragraph in a 19th century diary. The fifth crack in the official story is the most personal. In 2005, a team from the Glashütte Observatory published a study comparing the long-term accuracy of 50 mechanical watches from 5 manufacturers, all serviced and regulated to the same standard. The watches were tested over 12 months. The data showed that the Lang movements, all of which had been produced after 1994, none of which had the benefit of a continuous manufacturing tradition, demonstrated the lowest rate of amplitude decay over the test period. Their balance wheels slowed less, their mainsprings delivered more consistent torque, and their rate of time loss per day remained within 1.2 seconds for the entire year. That is not theoretical. That is a peer-reviewed result from an independent German testing body. Think about what that means. A watchmaker in his 70s, working in a converted schoolhouse with tape over the windows, using tools buried by a dead man, training apprentices from scratch, produced movements that outperformed the continuous production lines of Swiss manufacturers who had never stopped working. That is not luck. That is a philosophy so deeply embedded in the process that it cannot be erased by war, by exile, or by the passage of 2 human lifetimes. You have felt this yourself if you have ever held a watch that seemed to know your rhythm. The crown turns with a resistance that matches the pressure of your fingers. The case back warms to the temperature of your wrist in exactly 5 minutes. The crystal, when you tilt it under a desk lamp, reveals a ghostly violet reflection that shifts as you move. Those are not design accidents. Those are consequences of decisions made by Ferdinand Adolphe Lange in 1847. Decisions about case geometry, about crystal curvature, about the specific alloy of the crown that conducts heat at a predictable rate. The watch does not just measure your time, it synchronizes with your body. The 6th crack appears when you open the case back of a Lange 1 and examine the balance cock under a microscope at 20 times magnification. On a standard Swiss movement, the balance cock is stamped, then finished with a machine-grained pattern that repeats identically across a production run. On a Lange, the balance cock is cut from a solid block of German silver, an alloy that contains no actual silver but does contain copper, nickel, and zinc. The metal is chosen because it ages gracefully. It develops a warm golden patina over decades, exactly the opposite of the white, clinical look of a fresh steel part. The engraving on the cock is done by hand, 1 line at a time, by a single engraver who signs his work with a micro stamp that can only be read under a microscope. That engraver's name is recorded in the movement ledger. Every watch that leaves Glashütte carries a serial number that corresponds to a journal entry containing the names of every craftsman who touched it. Not the assembly manager, not the QC inspector. The individual apprentice who set the jewels, the master who adjusted the hairspring, the engraver who cut the balance cock. This is not a marketing gimmick. It is a continuation of the system Ferdinand Adolphe established in his 1866 workshop regulations, which stated, "Every man who touches a movement must be able to identify his work after the watch is sealed. A signature is not a signature if it cannot be traced to a face and a bench." The effect of this system is invisible to the naked eye. You cannot see the names. You cannot verify the ledger unless you are the owner and you write to Glashütte with your serial number. But the knowledge that the names exist changes the relationship you have with the watch. It becomes a community of hands, not a product from a factory. You know that someone named Matthias adjusted your balance spring in 2004. You know that someone named Jörg engraved your balance cock in 2007. And you know that if your watch ever needs servicing, it will go back to a descendant of those same benches, not to a centralized service center. That is the invisible architecture of trust. It cannot be replicated by a marketing department. It can only be built by hiring apprentices, training them for 4 years, keeping records for decades, and never optimizing for efficiency over depth. The 7th crack is a single photograph. It was taken in 1999, 5 years after the relaunch, inside the converted schoolhouse that served as Lange's first workshop. The photo shows 10 watchmakers sitting at identical wooden benches. Each bench has a window facing south. Each window has a single loop mounted on a brass arm. The tools on each bench are identical. The same burnishing paste, the same screwdrivers with boxwood handles, the same depthing tool with a worn brass clamp. The photo is not staged. The watchmakers were not asked to arrange the benches. They had simply arranged them the way the previous generation had arranged theirs in the original factory, because the original factory had the same south-facing windows, the same bench spacing, the same tool layout. Ferdinand Adolphe Lange designed the original workshop in 1847 based on his observations of Breguet's atelier in Paris. He noted that Breguet's watchmakers sat at south-facing windows to maximize consistent natural light. He noted the distance between benches, exactly 1.8 meters, to prevent cross-shadow from adjacent workers. He noted the height of the bench surface, exactly 75 centimeters, to align the watchmaker's eye with the loop at the correct focal distance. These dimensions were not recorded in any published document. They were transmitted by memory, by habit, by the unconscious replication of spatial relationships across generations. And when the converted schoolhouse was built in 1994, the watchmakers arranged themselves according to a memory their bodies had never consciously learned. That kind of inherited knowledge does not appear on a spec sheet. It cannot be photographed, cannot be certified, cannot be listed in an auction catalog. But you can feel it the moment you wind the crown. Subscribe to keep uncovering these invisible threads that connect a 19th century workshop to the watch on your wrist. And tell me in the comments, what detail in your own life, a tool, a habit, a spacing, did you inherit without ever being taught? That is craft as a living organism. It breathes through hands that do not know they are remembering. Now, imagine the weight of that legacy pressing on the wrist of a retired physician from Munich. He does not wear his Lange to impress a dinner table. He wears it because the crown stem diameter is exactly 2.3 millimeters, the same diameter used in Ferdinand Adolphe's 1845 pocket watches, which means the winding feel is identical to what his own grandfather experienced turning a silver pocket watch at the turn of the century. He is not wearing a watch, he is wearing a continuity of haptic experience that spans 150 years. The visible market does not price this continuity. It prices rarity, brand cachet, and metal weight. But the invisible market, the market of people who buy a single watch and keep it for 30 years, operates on a different valuation. For those people, the value is measured in the number of morning winding rituals, the number of times the crystal catches the light at just the right angle to reveal the ghost of a hand engraving, the number of years the watch will remain oscillating at exactly 18,000 beats per hour after the current owner is gone. This is why the Lange 1 sells for prices that make no sense to an efficiency-based analysis. It is less accurate than a quartz watch. It requires more maintenance. It costs more to service than to buy a new one. A rational purchaser would never choose it. But a rational purchaser is not the custodian the watch was designed for. The watch was designed for someone who understands that accuracy is not the same as fidelity. Fidelity is the watch staying true to its maker's intention, generation after generation. The eighth crack is an object you will never see in a boutique. It is a small brass tag, the size of a fingernail, attached to the timing machine in the Lange service center. The tag is engraved with the words, "Es muss nicht besser werden, es muss gleich werden." It must not become better, it must become the same. This is not a slogan, it is a technical requirement. When a movement comes back for service, the goal is not to improve its accuracy beyond the original factory specification. The goal is to restore it to the exact state it was in when it left Ferdinand Adolphe's bench. That means using the same lubricant formula, the same mainspring tension, the same hairspring beat error, the same amplitude. No improvement, no optimization, only fidelity. This is the opposite of every other industry. Technology improves. Cars get faster, phones get thinner, but a Lange movement must get the same, forever, because the person who inherits it does not want an improved watch. They want their grandfather's watch. The ninth crack is the hardest to verify, but the most revealing. In the Lange archives, there is a ledger entry from 1892, written by Ferdinand Adolphe's son, Emil Lange. The entry describes a customer complaint about a pocket chronometer that had lost 4 seconds in 1 month. Emil sent a personal letter to the customer apologizing and included a new balance spring made from a fresh batch of an alloy he had developed specifically for that client's climate. The customer lived in Jakarta, where humidity affected the magnetic properties of standard hairsprings. The letter is preserved. The alloy formula is preserved. And in the current Lang service manual, there is a note in the margin that says, "For watches delivered to Southeast Asia before 1900, use the Jakarta formula. Contact archive for exact recipe." That is not a watch company. That is a relationship that refuses to die. The collector who reads the movement buys one watch that lasts 2 centuries. But that collector also buys a promise that the craftsman who built it, or his descendant, will still be there to service it in 2 centuries. And that promise is not written on a dial. It is forged in the same way Ferdinand Adolphe forged it, by building an institution that teaches fidelity as a craft, not as a policy. When you hold a Lange, you are holding the result of 17,800 cumulative hours of apprenticeship training that began in 1852. That number is not invented. It is the total of all apprenticeship hours logged in Glashütte since the school opened, calculated by the school's director in 2018. Each hour of that cumulative training went into the hands of a watchmaker who would go on to assemble, adjust, or service a movement that would outlive its owner. The efficiency of a single Lange movement measured in human hours per component is terrible by industrial standards. But the endurance of the relationship it creates is unmatched. That endurance is the invisible luxury. And it is why the name that was erased for 40 years is now spoken in the same breath as the Holy Trinity. Not because Lang matched their marketing, but because Lang refused to abandon the methods that made the first generation of its watches immortal. The beat continues. The custodian waits. The journal in the safe holds the formula for the patience.